Good evening, welcome. Thank you all for coming out to the snow-filled week in Toronto. I'm Sommer, Community Daniels faculty, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to Material Evidence, a discussion and debate of design, data, and visualization. Tonight's event is part of the Daniels Fora series, which is now in its fourth year. The goal of the Fora series is to bring together different perspectives in order to raise the level of debate, build relationships, and stimulate discussion around issues relating to architecture, landscape architecture, urbanism, and the visual arts. For those of you that regularly attend our lectures, symposia, and exhibitions at our regular site, which is our faculty on College Street, you know that we have really a number of different streams of public programming. This particular venue, the Fora, are unique among the stream of programming because they're meant to engage not only our students, alumni, and our professional colleagues, but a broader public as well. Many of our previous Fora events have concentrated on the relationship between architecture and city building because this is a focus across all of our programs and our faculty's research. We've explored urban issues such as traffic, the way the city's financed, the new science of the architectural surface, the architecture of health, what architects have in common with writers and filmmakers in how they construe our understanding of cities, and what we might mean by words like sustainability and sprawl. Tonight's focus on data and visualization is meant to signal a new axis of interest and activity in the Daniels faculty. Last year, after a long period of negotiation and deliberation at the University of Toronto, we were successful in moving all of the university's programs in visual studies to our faculty. Our ambition in doing this was to make design thinking more central to University of Toronto's traditionally humanities and science-based teaching and research culture. That is to push visual and design literacy alongside writing and math-based forms of ideation. We also launched the Global Cities Institute last year to build on two strengths at our faculty. Our strength in developing data on cities with the City Indicators project that one of our speakers tonight, Patricia McCarney, will be presenting, and our work in the area of visualizing cities and landscapes. Now, people at universities like to talk a lot about interdisciplinarity, and it's certainly true that working on cities requires many different kinds of talents and disciplinary inputs. But I think what has to be shared, and what really moves beyond the issue of disciplines, and what has to be shared in this kind of work, is a sophistication in the generation and interpretation of data and the measurement of what's happening in cities, and testing these things in spatial and geographic ways that use various modes of visualization. So we want to build up the capacity to do this in order to further work on cities and environments across the universities and elsewhere. So with the construction of our new complex at 1 Spadina Crescent, which is currently under construction, all this should add up for the Daniels faculty to art being a key university-based platform for advancing the art and design of cities and environments, both here in Toronto and beyond. So tonight we have an incredible panel with us to begin what I hope will be a series of ongoing discussions on these topics. I'm very pleased to welcome the New York Times visual op-ed columnist Charles Blow, the media artist Ben Rubin, and Patricia McCarney, who is the director of the Global Cities Institute and a professor here at the University of Toronto. Now, I'm going to forego the introductions that I usually do, because I hope you all have all been reading about our guests in the program you received when you came in tonight. Before getting started on my introductory comments with the subject matter, I want to take a moment to thank our friends at Herman Miller, who have once again provided the furniture here on stage for our discussion. We appreciate the opportunity to showcase Herman Miller's award-winning designs and continue to be thankful for their support of the Daniels Fora series. So the format tonight is that I'm going to offer a few additional comments to introduce the subject. Then each of our guests will present a short 10-minute talk. I will then moderate a discussion among the group, and if time permits, we will take some questions from the audience. So the question I'd like to table tonight, and that I've tabled with our guests, is in what ways a picture might be worth 1,000 words? The phrase, "a picture is worth 1,000 words," has its roots in advertising and the selling of newspapers. But nevertheless, it gets at the power of visualization in that pictures sometimes allow us to absorb large, sometimes complex forms of information and data quickly and in ways that text and numbers don't allow. Now, as an architect and an urbanist, I have a particular twofold relationship to the problem of visualization. First and foremost, to draw and model and make images is how a designer defines and thinks through a problem. In a sense, one thinks through forms and images even when words and numbers are part of the equation. But drawings and other forms of visualization also have agency. So there's a second part to this. They have the rhetorical function of engaging others in the possibility of what any of us might imagine. So that's what we mean when we say when we're seduced by a vision. And of course, there's a more mundane but key reality that architects and urbanists do not really build buildings and cities. They are physically built by others, sometimes now even by robots. And the robots or others base what they're doing on these on 2- and 3-dimensional drawings. So that's actually a much more direct form of agency. I actually don't think that it is much different for our guests tonight, a planner and political scientist, a media artist, and a journalist. Each of them must use images to develop and test their ideas before they bring them out, but they also use images to communicate ideas to the various audiences that they're trying to communicate with. So when we talk about visualizing data, we tend to concentrate on specific kinds of visualizations, namely maps, charts, and diagrams. And each of these has a very particular history and even a disciplinary origin. We might say some of them come from cartography or geography or statistics or even forensic science. Now, while I cannot give any sort of complete introduction to these origins or to the array of influences that come into play when we talk about visualization, I thought by way of introduction it might be useful to show a few images. If I can figure out how to, okay. This chart by Charles Menard from 1869 shows the number of men in Napoleon's 1812 Russian campaign, their movements, as well as the temperatures they encountered on their return path from Russia. Because as you might know, if any of you know this history, many of them died. Now, in recent times, this image was cited by the influential information theorist Edward Tufte, that's why I know about it, as an important and early modern example of charting time and space, and ultimately assessing the fate of a military strategy that did not account for things like weather. This is an illustration by Herbert Bayer from the 1940s of the space made in and around airports by control and landing protocols. In visualizing a space that might be thought of as invisible, it actually, yet this space actually exists in the space around airports and has effects on the form of cities. This is a more recent image in this kind of tradition. It's from MIT's Sensible Cities Laboratory. And it makes a topography out of the time and intensity of cell phone use in Cambridge, Massachusetts. For urbanists, this is among the most influential and I would say misunderstood maps. It's Nolli's map of the Vatican's buildings in Rome from the middle of the 18th century. This has come to be called the figure ground, a device that in the hands of planners and architects is supposed to show what space is the space that is public and white and what is private and black. Now, of course, there was no such thing as public space in Rome in the 18th century, and what this map was really intended to do at the time is to show the shape of space both inside and out that the Vatican had or wanted to have purview over. If we come forward in time more recently, and think about recent advances in mapping and satellite technology. This is from a project by done for the San Francisco Chronicle, in which satellite photography was used to make an exact calculation of the number of anti-war street protesters that were on the streets, this is a decade ago, in the wake of the US war in Iraq. What I think we'll also want to discuss tonight is literally sometimes how data becomes visual. This is what, for example, a project I worked on, some code looked like from a city. And how this moves into something that becomes more like this. This is an image based on zoning data showing what was built around Hell's Kitchen in New York City and how much could be built by the allowable zoning at the time. So it shows in brown the existing condition and in this kind of ice-like figure what was allowable. Sometimes drawings and maps like this is important to the impact of a project as a design itself. Then there are the serious interpretive maps, and what I meant before, really much closer to what I meant before when I say one thinks by visualizing. This is a map by the conceptual artist Mark Lombardi. Lombardi was really something more like a combination of archivist, librarian, and a conspiracy theorist who drew his ideas. The drawing you are seeing, and I'm going to show the next one. The drawing you're seeing spins a network of relations between the one on your left, between the Bank of Credit and Commerce International and a number of other multinational corporations. The other one on the right is a detail from a book on this artist that is from a map that connects George W. Bush to a number of, this is before he was president, to a number of multinational oil concerns, and ultimately connects him to Osama bin Laden. This is before 9/11. And in fact, Mark Lombardi committed suicide in 2000. After his death and after 9/11, the FBI took a great interest in these maps. So finally, to the politics, the direct politics of, now that what I was just talking about wasn't political, the politics of visualization. The following set of maps and charts is based on voting and income data from around 2004, around the US election then. And these maps have gone a bit viral in the US. It shows how the same states that lean right, that vote Republican, and are seemingly against big government and big government spending, receive the largest portion of federal dollars than the more Democratic left-leaning states. The geographic spreads you'll see on the left, under and over a dollar per capita. The geographic spread would be, and so these have been cited, and these are different forms of this information, in order to counter what some of the public discourse is about big government in the United States and who's arguing for and against it. And of course, we could make a similar spread would be familiar to those of us in the Canadian context, and we could probably even do one for the center and periphery of Toronto. So, among the things I want you to consider is the issue of the assumed authority of data and the differing forms of impacting engagement that the translation of data into visual and/or text-based representations might have. I'd also like to discuss the lingering question, especially in academia and political circles, about whether the ambiguity of images and visual representations makes them less appropriate than text and math-based forms of ideation for advancing knowledge and elevating discourse. So we'll come back to that. I want to invite you to the stage Professor Patricia McCarney for the next presentation.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the introduction, Richard. And I'm charged this evening with talking to you in the position as first speaker about data. Visualization, but basically setting the stage on how the data that we're working with can actually start to build towards better and better visualization over the next decade. We're at an incredible turning point on data in general, but city data in particular. So it's my pleasure to present to you some of the work that we've been building here at University of Toronto since about 2008. This presentation, I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to spend a few minutes at the beginning on part one, which is around the Global City Indicators facility, which is this construction of standardized data that we've been working on. And then the second part is where we're moving to build the GCIF into the Global Cities Institute, which was just launched a few months ago, where we're starting to take the data forward into analytics, visualization, governance, planning, management, etc. So I'm going to say quite a bit in the next few minutes about this standardized data. As many of you who work in this area of cities, you probably are already aware that city data is extremely weak, extremely uneven, non-standardized, so that cities have a very difficult time talking to each other in an apples-to-apples kind of comparative framework. Let alone Toronto to Chicago, Shanghai to Sao Paulo. There's no comparative information out there. I know as a researcher, probably share this concern with many of you, but if you put together a table in any research publication with more than 2 cities on the left-hand side and more than 2 data points on the top, you probably have about 25 footnotes to show the exceptions to that data table because of various things. One being the definition of what we're measuring, 2 being the methodology by which we measure it, and I suppose 3 being the geographic boundaries of how we talk about cities. We can't even get the demographics right. So is Tokyo really the largest city? The answer, in fact, when you take municipal boundaries proper, the answer is no. Tokyo is not the largest city, but it's always ranked as the top city. So data is, before we start to visualize it, we need to make sure it's solid and it's standardized and it's comparable. So that's what my life has been since 2008, working with, at the beginning with the World Bank. When I was working in Washington as part of the bank, this data challenge was always in front of us, especially working in some of the poorer nations and poorer cities in Africa, Asia, Latin America. I worked in UN Habitat prior to that in Nairobi, and part of trying to build a data bank in the 1980s, and the challenges were just unparalleled. Data is really difficult for cities especially. There's lots of data in national statistical agencies, in national institutes, but city-level data is very weak and very poor. So we set out to correct that. We brought together 9 pilot cities. We asked them what indicators they were gathering. It turned out that cities are gathering a lot of indicators, a lot of data, spending a lot of money on it, but when you put them together, we brought the 9 cities to the university in 2009. There were 1,100 indicators across the 9 pilot cities, but only 2 of those indicators were comparable. So Sao Paulo couldn't talk to Bogota, who couldn't talk to Toronto, who couldn't, etc. And that's also between Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver because there's different provincial data collection points. So we set out to crack that, and we rewrote definitions and methodologies on 115 at the time indicators, and we started to invite cities to join. We're now at 254 cities that are reporting on 115 standardized indicators throughout the world. We're covering about 80 countries. But I should also say, you'll notice on the map that China is not represented well. In fact, we have 350 data sets from Chinese cities in our database now, and another 60 from the US of cities that aren't strictly members, but that are using the standardized methodologies that we've been building. So it's web-based, it's a web portal where cities report in, and they can actually download reports. So if you're, for example, if you're a city in this size range, between 1 and 4 million, you would have 58 in your peer group to compare yourself to. Or if you're Cape Town, for example, you would have 41 other cities in Africa if you choose to decide to find your peer comparators within the continent. If you're Amman, Jordan, 61 in the Middle East, or in 58 plus 14 over 1 million. So you can sort yourself in different places and different ways to get that global comparative framework where cities can actually learn from each other. That was the original strategy, was a learning framework for cities. It hadn't been available before, and we're now the only people doing this. People try to build these, but it's really, really difficult and also expensive. We've had support from the World Bank, from a lot of corporate partners, Siemens and Cisco and Philips and GDF Suez and now Scotiabank and others. And we also have support from a lot of the other international agencies, and primarily from the province of Ontario, who's stepped up and been really extremely generous with us in building this data platform here at the university. So the indicators go across city services and quality of life. There's all the themes, the usual suspects of waste and transit, et cetera, health. And we've taken it now, we've actually moved it forward into the International Organization for Standardization. So we wanted to make sure that we had built this to third-party verification of the data. So we have moved it forward through the ISO. We just had the approval, 28 countries voted, and it normally takes 5 or 6 years to get an ISO standard. And they didn't, when we went to them in Geneva, they really didn't know where to fit us because they have never had an ISO standard on city indicators. You know, they ISO standardized light bulbs and parts to this computer and even probably the chair base of support, our cell phones, et cetera, and tractors and cars, but they've never had an ISO standard on city indicators. So when we went, they didn't really know where to put us, but we ended up being fast-tracked through because we'd already written it, authored the methodologies, tested it with 250 cities now, and so they put us through a fast-track system, and we've just had it approved. So we're the first through the gate on an ISO standard for data on cities. We're now moving into resilience. I fly to Yokohama on Saturday for the next ISO meeting on resilient indicators. So this ice storm, Sandy, New Orleans, the Philippines. Cities are very interested in building indicators that measure resilience in cities and to become more risk averse. So we're starting a new standard, in fact, on Sunday. So, the last part of my presentation, I just wanted to talk about what the Institute is now doing. So we started to build from the GCIF up into the Institute, and we've just launched it, and we're starting to build a global conversation on cities because we're taking the data and starting to actually use it. It's mostly just been building it at this point and having cities reporting. So we're starting to build up a series of a white paper, for example, on Toronto. We're having an annual mayor's address. We're holding a global city summit this May where we're bringing all the cities to Toronto to talk about data in cities. So finally, I just wanted to show you 3 examples of what we're doing now with this data. Data representation is taking off in all kinds of different directions. I'm sure this evening will be incredible to hear from our colleagues tonight on how visualization is starting to work. We're starting to think about how to move from this, which is all numeric Excel spreadsheets of data that we have in our database, to more visual representation, which especially citizens and city managers and mayors can get their heads around. This is a nice, simple, which cities will flood when, and the answer is quite obvious. Moving to analytics then, we're moving into visualization and analytics and thinking about policy. So we started something called policy snapshots it's our first step in taking the data forward. So we just launched one last year on cities and prosperity and one on cities and aging this year with Philips. This one is really tracking the top graph, which is the typical one we always see. About 70% of the population of the world will be living in cities by 2050. And 65 and up, the aging population, at a worldwide level will be at 183%. So when we hear Prime Minister Harper and others talking about the aging phenomenon, we have to understand that the aging phenomenon is really a city phenomenon. When we move it down to more regional, rather than this bigger global thing that we start with, if you look at some of these increases, they're just unbelievable. There's 366% increase in North Africa and the Middle East in that age cohort of 65 and up. That's pretty much unheard of. and Sub-Saharan Africa, 291. Those are the cities that are going to face the greatest challenges of an aging population that are already acutely challenged due to poverty and services, especially in health. We then take it down. This is another way of visualizing information that we've started to take down to the city level with our individual cities. So that's Bulawayo, Zimbabwe on the left, and I think it's Brisbane on the right. We've also started to build, these graphs on the left help to showcase this column 65 and up. So if you look at Milan, it's already about 1/4 of their population is over the age of 65. Toronto is not too bad at 14%, but then you look at Shanghai, it's only 10% in that age bracket, but it's 2.4 million people, the size of our city, which is already over the age of 65. So we're starting to build this analysis. Another way of presenting some of the challenges is around health, for example, where we show, we put it into quadrants, and then we also had this third dimension by income. So you can see that it's not just even all poor cities, but also some of the larger cities that are very challenged in terms of health care. The second part of how we're starting to use this is around indices, to actually take the base indicators and construct them up to an index. So UNICEF approached us about building a child-friendly city index. So we took the indicators that we've been collecting on the right, put them into sub-indices according to the UNICEF dimensions, and we've just tested it with some of our pilot cities. And I wanted to show you these diagrams. These radar diagrams they're not that pretty, but they do have a policy potential for entry points for UNICEF, for the World Bank, for governments, for city managers, et cetera, in terms of how you think about this. So in the case of Buenos Aires, for example, they're doing pretty well on a child-friendly basis, but safety and emergency is the weak point. So this offers an entry point for policy and for action and investment. And then we did the same for some of the other pilot cities, Sao Paulo also for safety. But then if you look at Amman, I think this is, yes, Amman, you can see that mobility and cell phones and internet are their problem. Safety isn't too bad, but this also helps UNICEF to think about entry points for decision making. And finally, the last thing I was going to show you is this issue of how data and geography come together. If we think about cities and the economic functional area, we all know that the city of Toronto or the city of Melbourne proper is not the economic functional area of those cities. So we started we had a pilot exercise where we started to think about boundaries for Toronto, and we have the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which is all a very rural area up to Scugog, et cetera, or we have the Hamilton, Toronto, we have the Greater Golden Horseshoe. We have all of these different ways of thinking about our boundaries. But we decided, working with all of our municipalities around the horseshoe, that it was important to think about boundaries in terms of the built-up area, to really start to try and think about that. So we mapped densities, and then we layered the area municipalities, single-tier and lower-tier municipalities on top. Then we built it to the upper-tier municipalities with Durham and Peel, et cetera. And first time that this group actually came together to talk about these issues in a room where we had 36 municipalities, upper, lower, middle, single tier rather, and 9 ministries at the province to talk about what the use of this data would be, and they all agreed that their first priority was to talk about competitiveness on the global stage. To think about, because the argument, the Shanghai-Nanjing corridor is one of the focal points for trade for Shanghai. It's not just Shanghai, but it's Shanghai-Nanjing corridor, Greater Melbourne, Greater Chicago, the San Francisco Bay Area, et cetera. So we talked to them, and I think one of the unexpected outcomes of all this work was sometimes data can trump politics. Politicians and senior managers and senior leaders come together to talk about data. It trumps politics because they're actually in the same room talking about why it's important when you have trade missions to think about this broader group. So we then looked at transit, and we mapped it and drew boundaries, and we looked at this night lights comparators also across Chicago, Shanghai, San Francisco, and Toronto. And in fact, our region is rather comparable. We've established peer groups according to all of that. And the last slide I wanted to show you is, this is just one of about 7 that we've taken the aggregated data. So it turns out as a region, when we don't include the rural areas and we actually map it, we're a very highly educated population and almost on par with the San Francisco Bay Area. I mean, that's music to everyone's ears who are out on trade missions worldwide for this kind of work. So that report we just launched a few weeks ago, that's on the website if you're interested. And that's where I'll stop. So thank you very much for your attention.
Ben.
Well, that was very exciting. It's hard to find data that is sort of well aggregated and put together. You know, it's a fantastic thing that there's a kind of standards initiative coming together. So, and I'll sort of address that from my own strange point of view here. I'm Ben Rubin. I'm a media artist, and nobody really knows what that means. In a nutshell, in my case, I went to, I got my undergraduate degree in computer science, studied also semiotics and film, and then I went to MIT and did a master's in what was then their documentary film program, but not an entirely typical one. Data and imagery and storytelling are all kind of deeply baked into me in some way. This topic of material evidence is it's a great one for me. And so I'm going to give a bit of a preamble, and I'm going to let this is a visualization I did a couple of years ago with Mark Hansen and Jer Thorpe. We collaborate a lot together these days, and it's basically about runways and airports, and like most of the work that I do, even when it is, you know, in some ways like this is a data visualization of sorts, I don't think it really falls into any of the 3 categories that we've been talking about. It's not really map, it's not really chart, it's not a diagram exactly. And I think I have a kind of a immediate suspicion of data visualizations and graphics. I feel that images can, in a way, be much too powerful as rhetorical tools, and can overwhelm the sort of nature of the data that they are based on. And so a lot of my work really is about looking for ways to kind of defeat that rhetorical power, or not claim or try to establish any kind of mystique of authority about these visualizations. Modern data visualizations are kind of an outgrowth of simple plots, graphs, maps, diagrams that were not originally created for their aesthetic appeal, and until the late 20th century, they were, really almost entirely visual tools for use by scientists and others who were working directly with quantitative information. And they tended towards a very utilitarian or kind of technical aesthetic, if there was any aesthetic consideration at all. But today, visualizations can be really captivating and compelling and beautiful, and they can tell very complex stories. And when they do that, they often impart meaning in some way on these vast collections of otherwise inscrutable data. But every visualization is ultimately based on data that has been put together by people. And that's something that the Global Cities project, it seems like that is the fundamental challenge there, is that these data sets are messy. They're dirty. They're a result of a lot of different people with different methods, and almost every data set I've ever worked with has been, to one degree or another, kind of a mess. So I'm going to talk about one of these quite interesting messy data collections. So this is nothing more than what you see. It's just sort of normalized in size, these satellite photographs of airports, more or less based on their perimeters. And what this is organizing the runways of these airports by their kind of geometrical similarity, the angles, the number of runways, the ways that they intersect. So it's a purely visual kind of sorting of them, algorithmic, and it does some interesting things to the underlying data. It mixes the airports in unexpected ways, and those are the codes. So just going to jump out of this if I can. So this is one of the few projects we've worked on that does use a kind of geographical representation of data. This is a piece of a larger project where we were taking population data from the UN and a lot of non-NGO groups and creating these population maps. And in this particular representation, all the static, each dot represents 1,000 people, each sort of white grain, and these are sort of animated so that those grains are then drawn towards the places where to represent finally the actual distribution of population in the world. And here's another view of population just in this sort of simplified contours. So most recent data set that I've been working with, again, this is with Mark Hansen and Jer Thorpe, is the collections database from the Museum of Modern Art. And if you think it's hard for a city to get its data ducks in a row, try the collection of curators at MoMA. The data is very messy. It's very heterogeneous. Each department seems to have a very different idea of what a description means, or what dimensions are even. So this is one way that we sliced
John,
Robert,
Robert, David, Paul, William,
collection.
Richard, Peter, Charles, Michael, James, George, Jean, Hans, Thomas, Walter, Edward, Jan, Joseph, Martin, Mark, Frank, Louis, Alfred, Max, Otto, Stephen, Jack, Alexander, Henry, Jose, Carl, Andre, Henri, Arthur, Daniel, Harry, Pierre, Roger, Albert, Bruce, Carl, Philip, Bill, Fritz, Jim, Alex, Bob, Juan, Tom, Antonio, Bernard, Kenneth, Roberto, Victor, Alan, Boris, Christian, Mario, Werner, Anthony, Dan, Jonathan, Marcel, Chris, Christopher, Eric, Joseph, Alexander, Ernst, Herbert, Larry, Luis, Mark, Morris, Nikolai, Sam, Tony, Carlos, Donald, Francis, Franz, Georg, George, Jacques, Joe, Ken, Vladimir, Ben, Dennis, Yvonne, Keith, Norman, Renee, Stanley, Bruno, Don, Douglas, Herman, Lee, Nicholas, Ralph, Rudolph, Stephen, Terry, Adam, Adolf, Carlo, Ed, Ernest, Fernando, Frederick, Gary, Howard, Hugo, Johannes, Jules, Matthew, Patrick, Steve, Tim, Wolfgang, Alan, Barry, Eduardo, Emilio, Eugene, Fred,
So rather than make a graph of the number of male names in the group of artists who are represented, we decided to do a data dramatization, I guess. And part of the reason to do that is, again, to sort of move away from the idea that a picture is the best way necessarily to represent data. Sometimes embodying the data, giving it voice in various ways, setting it into motion or putting it into a dramatic situation is another way to represent it. And so this is an earlier piece. It's called Listening Post. Wow, I have 13 seconds left. You better hurry. That also sort of, I guess this comes back to one of the biggest challenges that I try to take on with any piece that I do that has to do with data, is to find a way to represent not only the mass qualities of it, the sort of numerical, quantifiable relationships between groups and clusters and different population divisions within a data set, but also to be able to see at the same time the character of the individual pieces of the data. So in one case it was the names, first names. This is a piece called Listening Post, where in this installation environment, and this also has sound, I won't play it, you had chat. This is a piece that's 12 years old by now, so the sort of primordial form of social media was internet chat before there was Twitter. But we were monitoring thousands of chat rooms and trying to feed these in real time into a kind of visualization and sonification system and characterize it. But it at every point in that piece, it felt very important to keep a sense of that individual character of each of these chat messages, while at the same time kind of showing them en masse so that their collective character also starts to register. So that's kind of the push and pull that I try to engage with in a lot of these pieces. And this is the last one I'll show. It's very quick. This is called The Language of Diplomacy. And it's basically taking as a database the WikiLeaks collection of diplomatic cables and simply extracting the list of the unique 6-letter words from that big pile of text. And so this is the physical form of it, and I'll show a quick video. So these are not edited at all. They're just put in order of first appearance, but they just sort of play out over about 5 or 6 hours. you might think that the collection of 6-letter words in any given, large corpus of text wouldn't actually be that different, but it manifestly is. These are words that have to do with diplomacy and conflict and military situations. So that's it. Thank you.
Very cool, Ben. First, thank you for having me come to talk about visuals, because no one ever wants to hear me talk about visuals anymore. It's all politics and writing. So I think this was, I was talking to the new graphics director at the New York Times. I haven't been the graphics director there in probably 10 years. And I said, I'm going to give a speech today. He said, what? About graphics and visualization. So my name is Charles Blow, and I'm going to talk to you about 3 jobs I've had, all in visualization, and about the different kinds of audiences and the different missions of each of those jobs as it relates to how data is visualized. The 2 big things that I think are drivers for how you set about to visualize information is thinking very intently about the mission of the piece itself, and then about the audience that is going to receive it. Those are always different. In every context in which you create data visualization, those things are different. And if you focus on those and make those primary in the way that you design and the way you present information, the figures themselves become much more effective. I'm going to show a lot of pieces here, and I'll jump around a lot, but I'll tell you a lot about what our thinking was and what goes into these kinds of productions of visuals. So the first job that I'm going to talk about, it's not the first job I had, but it's the first job I'm going to talk about. I was the graphics director and design director for news at the New York Times. That meant that I was in charge of the group of people who produce maps, charts, diagrams for the paper. And that job lasted about 8 years, covered who knows how many wars, how many planes falling out of the sky, how many terror attacks, bombings. I mean, it really is an amazing opportunity to get to know about the world around you. And we used to have this idea, we used to say, you have to become afternoon experts. That meant that regardless of what it is, regardless if you ever studied it in school, by the afternoon, you need to be an expert on this subject. And so a lot of times, that would mean in the morning, we'd run to a bookstore and buy a book, and we'd say, you read the first 3 chapters, you read the second 3 chapters, you read the fourth 3 chapters, and then by afternoon, we'll get together, we'll talk about it, and we'll figure out what we're going to say when we go to this meeting at 4 o'clock. That's how it happened. But in thinking about the New York Times audience and newspaper audience, the first thing to remember is that newspaper is not an encyclopedia. There's a tremendous amount of data that can be made into charts, maps, diagrams. Nobody cares, right? It is about urgency. What matters to me today? What is going to matter to the largest segment of this reading population today? So first, let's start with what it is we were doing. We were producing information graphics. This is Oxford Dictionary's definition. There are a lot of different ones. I just say that it is using data and information to produce maps, charts, diagrams. I included, data maps at the bottom here because they didn't include it there. That's strange to me. So let's get into some of these. So these are kind of charts, right? So this is right after the attacks of 9/11. Thousands and thousands of people are affected by the attacks of 9/11. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, allows people to apply for help. Thousands of people apply. 31,578 people apply. This, going from left to right, shows you how many of those applications actually made it to being approved, which is here, 381. That was in the first months of the application process. People were panicking. This was a way that we, as kind of data designers, can help people to understand what is happening to all these applications, because people are like, I did it, what happened, I don't know, I haven't heard anything back. Visually, we can show you what's happening to the majority. Most of them were just getting dumped. They said it hadn't gotten back to them yet, or there was something, it was denied, and this is all the reasons that they were denied, and you can appeal. So 1,400 people appealed, so 29 were pending, 1,000 were denied again. So this was our way of getting at that. Another chart. This is this second month after the war in Iraq began, and Americans began to die. And that's a big deal whenever soldiers start to die. It's a war, it's gonna happen. But people start to say, okay, what have we done? Why are we there? And what we were trying to do with this particular chart was to put into context the number of people who were dying so far in the Iraq war relative to all other wars all the way back to, this is World War I. These are all monthly death totals for American soldiers. This was the first 2 months of Iraq. Part of that is just because the nature of war has completely changed. I mean, you used to send bodies on the ground, they would go in, and whoever, how many ever were still standing when you got to the place where you were supposed to be, that was a victory for the day. Now, war is much more airborne, a lot more sorties, drones even. We have a big debate going on about that in the United States. And so we're just trying to give people some sort of context for thinking about, if you are going to commit soldiers to war, it costs in bodies. And we have seen that to a much greater degree than we were seeing it at that point. Now, I want to sort of stop right here for 1 second, because I want to make one point here. Everything that we were doing at the New York Times came out of our best understandings of the cognitive processing of information. We set out as best we could to find every single book that had ever been published on the cognitive processing of information, so that we could see, we would know what was happening when we made a chart. And that included everything down to colors. I mean, when we went to color, that was shortly before, not shortly, but a couple of years before the war started. Every color you see here is a product of the architecture of the city of New York. The color palette of the New York Times is supposed to remind you of New York City. It was us going out with cameras and taking pictures of every significant thing in the city and coming back and seeing which colors were common. There was a lot of brass. There was a lot of limestone. There was a lot of tarnished brass. Everything that you see, even though the reader will not register it that way, we were trying to make sure that you, when you came to it, you felt comfortable with the display, regardless of whether or not you were able to register that. And there was also small things, like you're able to, the human brain is able to measure distances against each other very, very, very well. They are less able to register areas, to judge areas against each other. We're horrible at judging volume, right? So when we are creating displays, we have to take all of that into account. And so we say, okay, well, the only way you can measure, this data set has one or single digits in this column, and it has 100,000 units in this column. The only way to measure those things against each other is to use volume, because on a line chart, it won't show up. The 1, the 2, or 5, or whatever it is will never show up. volume-wise, it will show up. We are weighing constantly back and forth, though. If we do that, we know that the people will not be able to judge this. So when you do that, what do? So we get around it by saying, we'll put the actual number value on the sphere. That'll help. We do all those things. Other things that people don't pay attention to is that we came to understand that the way that lines interact with each other. So if you have a line, a vertical line, and one going across, if they touch, it discharges tension. If you have it come very close to touching, but it doesn't touch, it creates agita, because the brain wants it to touch. It's like, drag it, make it touch. So if the chart was kind of boring, pull the line back a little bit. All right, here's a couple of diagrams. I think diagrams is really, really important form of visualization. It gets very close to pictures, and it does something that other forms just cannot do. You can't write it, right? So this was about after the attacks of 9/11. This is the World Trade Centers, both towers. Underneath is what they call the bathtub. It was a containing wall. Now, what people don't understand about Lower Manhattan is a lot of it was not part of the island of Manhattan, right? It's just fill. They dredged out the rivers, and they would just take whatever they got from the bottom of the river, dump it on the side, and that became extra acreage of Manhattan. So it's very squishy, very loose. So when you build things down there, particularly something as big as the World Trade Centers, you have to have retaining walls so that the building would not shift. They were very afraid that when those buildings collapsed, that it would have damaged that containing wall or some of the supports that kind of come out like on a diagonal from that. And if those supports would have been damaged, that would have meant all of everything in Lower Manhattan would get really loose. And they didn't want that. This is, this is, going to war. I don't know if this is Afghanistan or Iraq or both. But, part of our job was to help people to, understand what are we about to get ourselves into. What is it going to take? What kind of equipment is going into the battlefield? And this was our way of doing that. And in this case, a lot of it was to calm it down, right? We were taking, our use of color or not use of color was to calm all of this down, because the level of anxiety around post-September 11th all the way through the beginning of the wars was like amped all the way up. And so a lot of the design decisions were to say, bring all of the excitement down so that it feels just like, processing information in a sober way. And so that is part of the kind of the design consciousness that goes into that sort of thing. This is just, a little bit more fun, but I guess the subject matter is not so much fun. But this is a diagram about how the eye works and age-related eye problems that people have. And what you see on the bottom here is we took images, same image, and the National Eye Institute doctored them for us. I thought it was hard for us to figure out how do you explain to somebody how someone else is seeing something. It's very difficult to help people to understand what your eye problem is if I've never experienced it, I've never had it. They were able to help do that. Something that's happening here, though, you'll see a lot of this. Circles. A newspaper is a big rectangle. It is filled with rectangles and squares in the design of stories and the photographs. One thing that we had to try to do is to try to figure out ways to break out of all these rectangles and squares. So a lot of what we did was to play around with shapes, either looking at the way data express themselves naturally in whatever shape that is and follow that shape, or when that fails, a circle will always work. So there will be a lot of circles. This is the SARS epidemic. Again, this is an issue of volume. But we had some cases, Some cases where you would have one case in South Africa. That's the light color is sick, the orange is recovered, and the dark red is died. By the way, you will never see an actual red in the New York Times. It doesn't exist. We couldn't find it in the architecture. Bricks were this color, so that's what we have in the New York Times. But the only way for you to do that, when you have one case here and more than 1,000 in Asia, is to do it with volume. So again, we run into this issue. There's no way that the mind will do what we want it to do, which is to do an accurate measurement to multiply this. One of our ways of getting around that was to say, we'll make each unit a cube. So that if you are so inclined to kind of estimate, you can do that, particularly of the number of dead, because it's not that many. So you can go 4 across 5 up. That's, you can get a good approximation of what that number is, because at this case, we couldn't actually put each number on the chart. But we're constantly thinking through all of those issues. This is kind of more just kind of atlas kind of mapping, but this was in the news pages. This is Israel. Colors of, these are populations, and this is kind of like just to illustrate the kind of Swiss cheese nature of the West Bank. One thing about that urgency quote that we always liked, even though it's completely sexist, it's from the 40s, which I guess people were more sexist then, but. It's a quote of a quote of a quote. So we don't even know who exactly said this, but the guy goes, "Let me tell you something, kid. If you gotta grab the reader by the throat. He's on a train, it's hot. He's trying to hit on his secretary, sexist. She's not giving him the time of day. His wife is mad at him. His kids need braces. He doesn't have the money. The guy next to him stinks." That happens. It's crowded. You want him to read your story, you better make it interesting. And we're constantly thinking about, like, you're competing with everything. You're competing with other newspapers, you're competing with television, you're competing with the blogs, you're competing with everything on the internet, you're competing with the idea that people can actually go and find their own data and make their own visualizations. You really do have to make it matter. It really does have to stand out as something that really matters to those readers. So these were some of the things, the kind of guiding principles for us. We said the New York Times is going to, in the graphics department, is going to be more laboratory than church. We are not going to be respecters of the kind of, the parameters that people put on what is great visualization. We will understand every single part of what makes great visualization so that we can break the rules. So we were constantly trying to not only have great catalogs in our minds of all the visualizations we could ever find, but also to try as best we could to invent new forms of visualization. We realized that there was a such thing as form fatigue, that there was a handful of graphical forms that everybody always used because, in fact, they do work. Bar charts and fever lines and things like that. But the problem is that people use them for everything, right? So they use them for the number of people dead and also for the number of people who like Pokemon. So all of that kind of comes together and it just gets lost. So we are constantly trying to figure out, is there a way to change this so that people don't come to this and just think, okay, it's another bar chart. And if there's not enough difference between the things being measured, then people kind of gloss over. So these were our 3 R's: research, find references, and revolution. One of our great references, every atlas we could find, some of the old atlases, they were great in terms of like things that people did. One of our favorite old publications though, Fortune magazine from the late 1930s, early 40s. I have no clue who the designers were. They were absolutely amazing. So we did our best to find every single one of these magazines. There's a lot of eBaying going on at the New York Times. So this thing is huge. It's like, it's a fold-out supplement, about this big. Oh, I keep hitting this. And it's during the first stages of the war, and it's, whoever controls the World Island, which is, the semi-attached, in some ways mostly attached, 3 large continents of Africa, Asia, and Europe. And the red is the Allies, and the green, dark colors, that's the Axis. They control that part. And it's just beautiful, every little piece of it, the way, you can't really see this, but the way they teach you to read the map, everything's fantastic. So we were going into the Iraq War, we're like, okay, I remember that big circle, we're doing that. Like every day we had like the same sort of concept. And this was like the advance on Baghdad. Every day they would have a mission control, I guess whatever it was, would have a briefing, and they would say what happened that day. We had people on the ground, reporters on the ground. They would feed us information about what was happening in the city that we know, and we would plot all of that. And this is a concept that we had tracked from the United States Civil War mapping. That was really the way people found out about what was happening in the Civil War. There was a map in some newspapers every day, and every day they would update on what was happening in the Civil War. And so we said we want to do that Civil War kind of mapping for this war every day, what's happening and what's going on. Second job, oh my God, I think I'm running out of time. All right, so we're gonna have to speed up. National Geographic, and so I was the art director of National Geographic. I used to tell people all the time, the only place that I would leave the New York Times to go was National Geographic. I don't know why I was saying that. I was just saying that. I used to look at National Geographic as a kid, and so I would just say it all the time. I just thought like glossy paper, they do really nice stuff. And I'm at my desk one day, and the art director of National Geographic, I talked to him once on the phone, never met this guy. He calls me, he says, hey, I'm leaving this job. You're the only person I want to have it. You want it? I'm like, what? Who does that? Yes. So I go down, a couple of interviews, and I'm the art director of National Geographic magazine. Yes. Now, National Geographic is different from the New York Times. It actually is more of an encyclopedia. They think of themselves as kind of a quasi-scientific journal, and the readers who come to that magazine think of it that way too. They don't think of urgency in the way that we thought of urgency in a newspaper, which is what is important today. Urgency for them is like, this decade is kind of getting warm, So it's a very different kind of metabolism at the magazine. You could propose a story, and it would run 2 years later. Like there were stories that like I proposed when I was there, and they didn't run until after I left. But so what you did in National Geographic, there's information graphics, kind of the same thing that we were doing at the New York Times. But then there was reference quality cartography because they were publishing actual atlases. We were just doing maps. They were doing maps with a big M. And then the kind of more tricky thing was scientific illustration, which is something that I was completely new to. So I'm going to go through this really quickly. My clock thing is gone, so we're good? Okay. All right. So these are just like the basic charts, the same kind that we have in the New York Times. Again, we are horrible at volume, so you try to get around that by putting the values on. This is paper and glass recycling of selected rich countries. United States, horrible. The size of the glass is, this is how much glass you're recycling, this is how much paper you're recycling. The size of the spheres is just the number of tons. So we make a lot of trash, we just don't recycle it. And these were like European Union averages, which were these lines. So we were horrible. This is a diagram that tracks the cycle of malaria and why it's really, really, really hard to find a vaccine to deal with it because it just never stops, right? So the mosquito bites someone who has malaria, and then this starts inside the mosquito, and then mosquito bites someone else, who doesn't have malaria and gives it to them, and this happens inside their body, and this is what happens inside the red blood cells of a person, and then it goes back out, and another mosquito comes, and it's like, we almost had it. This is another data map, shows, I don't know if it's all, this is many of the glaciers in a large number of glaciers. I don't know how many this is, and how rapidly they're shrinking in size. All those down. This guy's growing. I don't know what that is. That's my that's my refrigerator, and all the rest of these are like shrinking. And then this is the scientific illustration part, right? So this was completely new to me, and I always thought they're great illustrations, but I didn't understand what was happening in National Geographic. Every illustration goes through basically a scientific review. You have to have independent experts. Everything you see in the illustration is checked a million times. They're like, is that the necklace he would have worn? Is that the hat? When would he worn? They have skinnier pyramids. This particular story is about black pharaohs. Had nothing to do with me. I did not do this. I promise you. It happened. I was there. It was already on the books when I got there. Although I could not tell my friends that because every one of them was like, dude, I know you work in that geo, but you put yourself on the cover. I was like, that's not me. So, but this was the one that I thought was going to get me fired, right? So this is a thing called, bizarre dinosaurs. And so the way this works is, we worked on this for a year at least. It cost more than my salary. Like, it was just an enormous cost. And as best, there was a consultant, but normally we had an outside consultant. There was a guy who was in the building. The best I could tell, this guy, his only job was to work on this supplement. And every single thing, like, it's not like when you go to the museum and you see, like, there's a whole skeleton. Like, where'd you get that? Come on. It's like the Flintstones, like a whole, like Jurassic Park, a whole skeleton. No. There's like a knuckle, a hip, a tooth, and they're extrapolating from that to a whole animal, right? So that you have to have someone who knows what they're doing when they're doing it. So this guy knew this stuff backwards and forwards. And so we're doing this supplement, and he would come in and he'd say, yeah, but he wouldn't be able to articulate his jaw that much. I was like, dude, I just paid $25,000. You cannot tell me I have to do this over. He's like, yeah, we gotta close it like this much. Over and over. It took a year of this, but that was what went into scientific illustration. So when you look at an illustration in National Geographic, it's not just a pretty interpretation that the artist might have thought about what it looked like. No, it is every single visual source that anybody could ever find on that subject. We had one about the Iceman. The guy got frozen in a block of ice. Done. We were about to publish. And one researcher says, is that the kind of hatchet he would have had? Literally, like, the room goes into a panic. Everybody rushes out. Hatchet books, hatchet books, hatchet books. And it's the wrong hatchet. All right, so now I have to wind this down. I gotta go. Right, so now I'm back at the New York Times, right? So I go to that. I was actually commuting to DC. Craziness. So I was like, this is exhausting. I took all of December off, and I called my boss, and I was like, in early January, and I don't know exactly what I said, but it was something like this. I'm never coming back to work, right? He was like, yes. So, and he's like, you can work from home. I was like, yeah, whatever. I know you're just trying to hire somebody else, so let me find another job. So I had lunch with the executive editor at the New York Times, and he said, so you should come back. And he said, what do you want to do? So I said, I know you guys do these things called op charts on the op-ed page. Just get that cobble together that money, and I'll do them on staff. So I was going to do charts on the op-ed page. So they call me visual op-ed columnist. But as soon as I started doing this, I realized people were putting much more weight on the writing than on the visuals, and that it was a whole different animal. That what people expect from the opinion pages of the New York Times, completely different from what they expect from the news pages of the New York Times. So I had to the job is basically write persuasive essays, use information graphics as evidence for those essays. But I changed my design sensibilities completely because I'm now using objective data in a subjective context, right? They're basically paying me not to be objective. They're paying me for an opinion. But I don't want people to question, you can question my opinion and say, I disagree with what you're saying. I don't want you to question the data. So that meant that I dialed down a lot of the sparks on the charts on the op-ed page. So I just go through a few of these. This is, and I'm just obsessed with how religious America is compared to other wealthy countries. So I deal with that a lot. So this was, on this side was the percentage of people who in all these countries, and these are not all just wealthy countries, but many of them are, who say that religion is an important part of their lives, and this is GDP per capita going this way. And this is kind of the 50%, this is like $25 mark, GDP per capita, this is the 50% mark, people saying very, very important. All the other wealthy countries, these are the poor countries, right? Wealthy countries, this way. The US, which is all by ourselves out here. Another thing is in the US is that you basically cannot get elected to national office if you are not part of a religion, right? So this was a chart that showed the religions of members of Congress. Many of the Christian religion, the kind of denominations were going down, Methodist, Presbyterian, Catholics going through the roof. People who said they were unaffiliated, zero, blip, zero. The other thing that I do a lot of is give people kind of wake-up calls. There's that USA, we're the best at everything. So every now and then I run across something and they're like, you might want to reconsider that. This is infant mortality. So we used to be bad in looking at us and other wealthy countries, but we weren't the worst. But everybody else, infant mortality dropped tremendously, but ours didn't drop enough. So now we are the worst. And part of that is because our preterm births went up. And this is another American phenomenon, mass incarceration. This starts in 1982. This is the number of people in the criminal justice system. This is what it looks like now. We lock up everybody. You walk across the street, look back at somebody, sneer, and we lock you up. Revolutionary America. This was the beginning of the Arab Spring. At that point, it wasn't even called the Arab Spring. It was just like something's happening in Tunisia and Egypt. So these were the two countries that were upheaval. So I looked at the measures that I thought were common across, that were important to that, and said, what are the other countries in North Africa and the Middle East that share those sorts of metrics? And lo and behold, many of the ones that had the most in common with those were the ones where you had the Arab Spring. And I'm gonna have to sit down because I think I've done like 2 presentations in one, but thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Are we all on now?
Sorry.
It's good. We're going to go on for about a half an hour. Where to begin? Well, I want to come back to something that Ben said. You talked about a retreat from the rhetorical power of data. And with Charles's presentation, we saw a kind of, he described a kind of journey from trying to take complex things and give them complex representations to finding his own voice in the editorial page, and then finding very, very brute ways, in a way, to clarify and make information as seemingly transparent as possible. So, in this, we could debate, about the factual basis of the data that is being made transparent. But I want to ask each of you to speak about this, about the ways in which this communication is occurring. Charles is basically saying you have to kind of cut through the cacophony and the obfuscation and all of the kind of information overload to make single points. And you're saying something very different, but you're also talking about the kind of danger of communication, to say there's other ways of communicating that are either not entirely visual or that are emotional. So I'm going to ask you to begin, and then I'm going to.
Sure. Well, seeing those charts, like the infant mortality chart, is a great use of rhetorical graphics. It's not a point that is incredibly complex. It is not. And I guess a lot of the data that we being me, Mark Hansen, and Jer Thorpe, we're now kind of an official partnership. A lot of the data that we deal with tends to be very multi-dimensional. This is the kind of data you're swimming in. It's very complex. There are lots and lots and lots and lots of columns in these data sets, and so making sense of them can be an exercise in sort of creative shaping of them. But a graphic like that you showed is sort of it's an elegant, concise way of making a point that then the writing, can be what is the real meat on that. So I think I may have been talking about something a bit different. I very much admire that kind of presentation, and especially just bringing it down to that level of kind of.
Well, I actually find that, to me, like, I've been doing this now for 20-something years. And there was a moment where I used to, how many entry points can you have and how many different stories can you tell in one display? Now I completely the opposite. I'm just looking for the strongest story in the data. One story. You were talking before about, whether, picture worth 1,000 words. When I think about charts, I think the exact opposite of that. It can have 1,000 points of data, but I want one sentence out of that. I want you to say, this has gone from best to worst. This is twice what it used to be. It should be immediate, completely clear, because what I'm doing is arming people with information that they can then take into the world and have conversations and try to change minds of their own. And I really want them to have in their mind the image that I showed them about how much something has changed or what the relationships are among things, and that they can easily access that and explain it to someone. That it's a matter of factors of, this is twice or 3 times or tripled or whatever. And if there's a lot of data that makes that point, great, but as long as it's the one clear point. And sometimes it's not a lot of data that makes that point.
There's also, of course, a lot of kind of ethics to how those graphics are prepared. And, this is something you're very, very familiar with, I know. There's that great book that How to Lie with Statistics,
yes.
Right?
Yes.
That basically lays it out. There are all these very, very basic ways of stretching the axes and essentially pulling and pushing the diagram to kind of make a much stronger point than the data might show.
Right.
And I think, when I see the graphics that you make, it's clear. You're following a sort of ethical standard of data presentation.
Well, but there's always there's a push and pull, right? So I never want to say that any particular display is purely is it showing itself in its purest form, that there is no drama in this, right? So the space that I had on that page is very tall. So a lot of the charts are just very tall. So if I were designing in a different space, a different medium, National Geographic magazine, which is much more square, it wouldn't quite look like that. And you did make other kind of calls about how you label things, what do you include, can you include, if you're trying to chart the number of people in Congress by religion, and you can't do it on a short chart, but it was great for my space. But there are other things that when I pull it like that, I know that I'm like dramatizing something more than I would if I didn't have to fill this space. So I'm always, it's a push-pull, and I'm always kind of questioning myself as to, have I, is there too much of a trade-off here? Is it the drama that it provides, does it alter the meaning in some way of what I've done?
So I want to talk a little bit about where we get data from, and I want to get to the whole interest in big data. I'm going to pull Patricia in on this. But I follow your column, and I always check, because I always check where you get the statistics from. Often they're university studies and other things. How do you go about verifying what you think is a good study to draw the numbers from, and one that might because is there often more than one, or how do you?
Well, first I include links because I want it to be as transparent as possible. So, if you think that this study wasn't, the best one for it, just go and the comment section is there, and you can say, there's better data than that or whatever. And if it's really egregious, which God forbid, you can, write me and say there's an error. But
in your 20 years, do you feel like the process and in social science and other areas has improved around this?
I think the kinds of data that I tend to use are not really that questionable. So I'm using, I consider the chart to be, I use 3 Bs. I like these 3 things to be about beliefs, behavior, and biography. So I do a lot of political polling, and we have a polling group in our building. I send it to them, it's like, this is legit, right? They say yes or no, and then I use it or I don't use it. And then there's behavioral stuff, and sometimes those are studies. I almost never use one that has not been published by a peer-reviewed journal, so I know that there is some built-in safeguard there. And the biographies, I use my own life as a way to get in and out of it. But I don't know if it's necessarily that people have gotten so much better at data collection or not, but I just don't, having looked at data for 20 years, I can know if it's bad right off the bat, if it's something that's questionable, and I just steer clear of it. It's not that important for me to use, for me to risk it.
Yeah. So one of the things that's been going on, and a lot of corporations are interested in this, and it relates to things like in the United States, like the Department of Homeland Security, there is this notion that we can compile huge amounts of data, and I found your project around the WikiLeaks interesting because one of the things that some of the few people I've met in computer science talk about, did they talk about disturbing the data? There are these techniques where they go in and they try and find patterns, right? Like you did, like there's a certain word pattern, or because there's things that are being encrypted that might be have security information, but also they're just looking for trends, right? And in a sense, you're doing a kind of play on that in your project. So we come back to the kind of work that Patricia's doing and this interest in big data. There is now, in my view, a transition from using big data, for example, to master the financial markets, or to look at things like security, and transferring it over to the planning and management of cities, which are seen as complex ecosystems. I'll start with you, Ben, and then I'll go to Patricia. What do you think about the promise of that?
Well, I would love to think about the big data being used, collected, processed, and analyzed and used by cities for sort of public good. Right now, aside from the NSA that we don't precisely know the kind of quantity and exactly the use, and I'm not sure they do either, of what they're doing with all that data, the biggest real user of big data at the moment is the online advertising world. There's nothing like it. It's just an unparalleled collection process, and it's very much not transparent to us. In fact, one of the projects we're working on in the studio is a grant from the Ford Foundation to create tools so that people can sort of track and analyze their own exposure to advertising that's coming to them through these brokered analytic systems that feed advertising into the margins of 90% of the websites that anyone looks at. So step one is to give people a kind of way of accounting for that, of tracking it a little bit, of seeing how much directed advertising they're getting and where that's sort of tending to come from, and being able to observe their own dynamics, and then on a voluntary basis submit that data for study so that it can be aggregated and we can see as a society what the trends are, how that advertising economy and machinery is all working. But
in this phenomenon you're describing, there's always the question of whether there's the risk that people who don't shop or don't have the financial weight or aren't actually active in that zone, that not a lot of data is being collected on them, and they're not even part of the statistical analysis.
Well, I wish I didn't shop. I mean, you like click on one sweater and that sweater like stalks you across Facebook. And, like everything you open up, the sweater is there. It's like, are you kidding me?
Yeah. And the way
I've had a rowing machine do that to me recently. Yeah.
Yeah. The way that works is somewhat mind-boggling. But to your point, there's no way at the moment to know what kind of information advertisement services are not being offered to someone who is not as much of a player. And that's the Ford Foundation's interest, I think, in this, is to be able to look at the ways that people are better served and worse served by this whole system that's evolving on the basis of whatever criteria, to see if there's discrimination going on that's systematic, that is otherwise kind of invisible.
So Patricia, in working with these cities all over the world, is there sometimes a worry that in these different cities, what's on the radar and what isn't on the radar in terms of what they're able to collect and who is...
it goes back to this question of the audience, your point, Charles. Cities are very interested in how this data can help them. And so the audience for this data that we've been collecting is very much cities. And cities are in it for comparability. Right. So we always get asked the question, well, who's the best city? Well, who's the world-class city? Or what is the safest city? Or what is the most prosperous city? Or what is the best healthcare? Or who has the best transit? It's the best, right? And we've been
But by the way, those
careful.
cities that are always rated the most livable cities are usually pretty boring.
Yeah, it's true, and we've stayed clear of those ratings because it's really tricky. It's really tricky territory, and the economists and Economist Intelligence Unit puts out a lot of data on these ratings and rankings, and there's a whole business around it. But we've been very careful to tread around that. But on the big data question. It's really interesting times because this data, I don't know what we call our data. Is it small data or little data or simple data? I don't know. It's indicators that cities want and need. But then there's this big data out there. And when I was at MIT for a big data, bad data conference, I don't know if you heard about it, but that was the title, Big Data or Bad Data. And it was, all the security data, et cetera. they had some really interesting work going on around machine learning with a ton of data. And so for us, you know, we're faced right now with these huge numeric data sheets, just, you know, and do we really want to say who's the safest city in the world, or could we do something more interesting with it? But then when it's a sea of data, there's so many points in so many cities, so which entry point do you want to? This is where big data and machine learning can be really valuable, because they sort through and they find incredible, well, they create algorithms and they have incredible linkages that we would never have thought of. For example, on safety, machine learning, they threw all the data in, and we would never have correlated the level of safety in a city with change in temperature. But machine learning spit out this high correlation that if you have a 2-degree change in a city, in a particular neighborhood, like they can take it right down to a street corner, where there's a change in temperature of 2 degrees, crime skyrockets, and it also, you know, is a seasonal variation by neighborhood. So we would never have done that with our, but, you know, this is where big data can be really useful. This is, you know, correlations that we wouldn't have ever dreamt up. The big data that Rio is using with IBM, you know, that command center, I don't know if you've seen it, but they have all of the 311s, the 911s, and they have 12 different organizations
it's an emergency,
within the city.
A kind of
early warning.
Early warning.
Even just traffic.
It's like a kind of war
It's
room
also
where
just traffic.
all of the information about what's going on in traffic and crime
Yeah.
comes in order to somehow manage crisis,
Yeah,
potential
or
crisis.
traffic jams, or there aren't enough taxis over here, or there's a traffic jam here, or there's going to be a landslide because the rainfall is such in this particular favela in Rio, for example, which I was actually going to go and tour the command center in Rio, and they had a landslide because of so there were no tours that day because they were on crisis alert. So it helps, you know, it helps these early warning systems, these big data kind of control centers. IBM's doing work on cell phone data coming in for origin destination trips. You know, I don't know if you've seen the map of it's a video of Istanbul, where they had Vodafone. Again, it's an issue of security and information, and Vodafone gave them the data. I don't know how they got it, but it was in a partnership with Vodafone. And they actually mapped from 2 a.m. through 24 hours origin destination trips in Istanbul. So you can actually use it for traffic planning, you know,
which has terrible infrastructure. So there's a lot of traffic problems there.
Yeah, there's a lot of traffic problems, but as a tool, you know, you look at the map, and sure enough, at 5 o'clock, there's a lot of rush hour here, and at 5 a.m., there's none. So didn't we know that, or I don't know, like it's a lot of information. Sometimes big data is just really expensive and really time-consuming, and then the end product isn't all that interesting. It's not something we didn't know already. So, you know, the jury's still out, but it's fantastic, the opportunities. It's for me, it's how you mash the two together, because we have this level of data, which we know is grounded, verified, real, and cities need it and want it and care about it. But then there's this big data up here, which is also informing origin destination on transit, or command centers on emergency response, resilience on Hurricane Sandy, et cetera. So, you know, it's how you mash the two levels of data together, which is where I'm sitting now with some of our corporate partners. I'm talking to them about how to put this data together in ways that, because they kind of depend on us because it's real, and they have real time, which we can help to, you know, inform upwards, and they can inform downwards. But the handshake's not clear. We're just starting to explore it. So.
Yeah. So, Charles, you talked about the need of newspapers to communicate in a kind of real-time sense, an immediate sense, what people need to know now, and all of the kind of enthusiasm over the last 10 years around the web and emerging ideas of ubiquitous computing is that you can get that feedback and that information faster and faster, right? So, and you talked about the kind of time, the sense of time in National Geographic, which is looking at natural history, which doesn't move, you know, on the daily news cycle. and your work actually touches on, you didn't show all your project, but certainly touches on this idea about how you make data and information ubiquitous and sort of come in through various senses. I'd like to ask, moving to a kind of closure and maybe take a question or two, what's your feeling about the future of ubiquitous computing, though it's handheld, it's in environments, for this, for the goal that I think each of you have in different ways of changing hearts and minds, of influencing understanding, influencing politics, policy, and actually, whether it's shopping or entertainment, the possibility of communicating ideas of import to society in this kind of cacophony of tweeted things from the Kardashians.
I mean, one thing that I see happening in the graphics department at the New York Times, and I can take no credit for this, I haven't been part of the actual department in years, but one of the most useful things that I see them doing is creating smart, user-friendly tools for the access of large amounts of data, and you can personalize that data, or you can adjust levels and figure out how you want to see it yourself. That that takes some editing, some curation, and also a real design sense to make sure people have a way in. A lot of the data that exists, it exists, but it's behind a wall somewhere, or if it's not behind a wall, it's impossible for you to figure. Like I go to census site. I mean that should be the easiest site to use. I'm like, I just want to find a population. I just can't with this site. Like, what am I supposed to do? I go to them. I said, tell me how many people live in Pittsburgh. I just can't deal with this. But what a lot of times what they're doing is just making smart interfaces, and I think that idea of smart, useful tools translates all the way down to apps. So that if the tool works, you just adjust all the way down, and people still want to know. So if I'm just trying to figure out, there's a new bill that just passed, how will it affect me? I put in my zip code, how many dependents I have, how much my income, and then it gives me what I want to know. That is the smart, I think, new way of people, the way people use the web. I mean, that's why I think, the Googles of the world got freaked out about Siri, because it wasn't 10,000 answers. It was one. You ask, where can I get ribs tonight? And it's like one answer, right? Instead of what Google prides itself on is giving you a list that goes on and on and on. And so I think this idea that people want an answer, not 1,000 answers, is really good for if the publication or whatever can figure out ways to deliver the one answer that I want.
That scares me a lot, that idea, because it's fine if it's the New York Times doing it, but that is, in fact, the goal of a lot of commercial big data endeavors, is to deliver the one answer, not the one answer you want, but the one answer someone wants you to have,
Right.
And I think we're at a real crossroads, socially and ethically and politically, with regard to big data. Big data in the commercial world comes from people. I mean, the data points are individual persons in the world. And at the moment, there is no social contract about
How that's used.
who owns that data? How does it get collected? Do you have to be, should you be notified when some aspect of your person is recorded as a data point? Should you be able to see that happening? Should you be able to opt in or opt out? And right now it's happening so pervasively, it's nonstop. We're all
without
being
any
tracked
regulatory-
constantly on
This-
There's
every
no
now and
so
then-
many levels.
Every now and then you just have to tweet good morning to the NSA.
Yeah.
You're already watching it, like, hey, good morning, what's up?
Yeah, but the commercial tracking too is so.
Yeah.
That notion that we need a kind of new social contract about ownership, that maybe I own my data and decide to allow myself to be tracked as part of a traffic study in Istanbul or over the George Washington Bridge, maybe.
But that's not going to happen, right? So
Yeah.
I was just reading yesterday, new guidelines in America that every car, I don't know when this will go into effect, will have to be able to talk one car to another, right? So this is moving towards the driverless car idea, but also that's data, right? So who's going to control that? How you know?
You can't go off the grid.
You can't. This idea, we're just going further and further and further. I don't know if there's. I don't know. You can't unring the bell. I don't think. I think that there's a point at which we've already passed where there's so much data that's being collected, and we've basically kind of acquiesced, and we say,
Well, we get a lot out
So
of it.
I have to say, Ben, in some of your work, there's a kind of hint of a kind of counter data tactic, right? That you introduce kind of difficult interference into, and we could imagine apps or programs where you actually distort or dissimulate your own information, right?
And another part of the social contract has to do with the inequality of access to data and who can afford to purchase it and who can't, right? So there's really unfair advantage out there. If you have money and you can purchase that data, you can make a lot more money. So how do you think of a social contract on that basis? So for UPS, for example, I know from some consulting companies that they will sell, UPS can sell their data about the number of packages picked up and delivered by small startup companies. So if they did a tracking as small angel capital or small investors investing in startups, and they decided that the ones with the most pickup parcels in the first 3 months of operation are the good ones to bet on and invest in. So the more parcels being picked up, the more active you are as a startup company. So therefore, they bought that data and they invested in those companies, and all those companies did well, and the other ones didn't.
So we had a symposium last summer where around new modes of visualizing the city, where we had someone who came and did a kind of avatar where you created a false startup company in Detroit where there were packages coming and going, where none existed, right? So it was very clever. Okay, I want to take one or two questions and then we'll close up. People should feel free to go because we're going over in time, but I think there's a social compact in taking questions. Does anyone have a question? The person in the red cap, his color stood out. Oh, you need the mic because you need to be recorded, and you're going to be data. You're going to be geo-referenced. Start anyway. I'll repeat your question.
I was actually reading an op-ed in the New York Times recently about infopolitics and how kind of what you were already discussing. And I think one of the solutions going forward with that is trying to find a way to make people more cognizant of the fact that people are collecting their information at all times and they have to be careful about what they share. And yet, I think clearly we're becoming more aware of it, but we're not at a point where people are actually doing anything about it on a personal level. So how do you think we can inform people and educate people and kind of campaign for them to be more careful so this whole corporate data collection thing doesn't get out of control?
I think that's a very difficult question. And, we are all engaged in this constant trading. Well, I understand that if I put this app on my phone, I have to click agree to this, endless terms of service thing, and I have a suspicion that that's basically selling myself out, giving away the data. But the map I get is so cool, that I have to, I just go ahead and I sort of shield my eyes and click I agree, and we all do that. And in many, many cases, it's a good deal, You give away some little bit of yourself, of some knowledge of yourself in exchange for something that's worthwhile, that improves your life, that, that has a value. But I think what's missing is transparency. I know what I get, but I really don't know what I give away. And I don't know the answer to that, other than, to sort of press for standards and ethical standards and regulatory standards and disclosure and sort of clarity. I mean, I think those, what do they call it? The end user license agreement is a bad thing, and there should be more transparency in what I'm giving away, what I'm opting into, in that sense.
I have an even more practical, I mean, this is not directly to your question, but I have a more practical quandary here, which is, I keep wondering 20 years from now, who's going to be able to run for office if all your pictures on Instagram of you like half naked, like how's that going to work? Because nowadays, if you have incriminating images, somebody in opposition research on the other campaign digs up everything they can find on you. And now when you're 19 years old, I was 19, nobody had any evidence of anybody doing anything. So now everybody's like a Vine, you have like your Facebook, and it's all craziness. And I kept thinking like, so what happens when you grow up and you want to run for office and you really are the best person? We just have that picture of you though, like. It's really, I really spent a lot of time thinking about that because I don't know maybe our kind of standards about will change and we'll just say, you know what, everybody has that, so that's no big deal. I hope, but if it doesn't, then that means that, the person who is scared of Instagram becomes the president. Like, I don't know what happens.
Well, I mean, there are in the built environment there are ways that people construct privacy, and people are going to have to learn the same in the digital world as well. That would be my response. Any other questions?
Just one question. We can say we are obsessed with data. We choose our professions, even by the chances of how good it might fare. We choose schools based on rankings and the cities where we live, etc., etc. But when it comes to real numbers that go against our grain, how we are built and how our mythology is, these numbers don't sink in. For example, the green movement, brings on these numbers for years and years and years, 40, 50 years, climate change and all these, water pollution. But we know these numbers, but we should immediately stop doing what we do, and we don't. So why is mythology, or is the mythos, or subdue the earth, as it is said in the Bible, much stronger than the facts that we have on hand?
Well, but you have to understand one thing, which is that there's a tremendous amount of money being put into an attack on science and facts in a lot of societies, particularly Western societies. So whenever people say like, the climate change numbers are going in the wrong direction, and I say, do you have any clue how much money that some industries are pumping into the idea that to discredit the science that everyone accepts? And it's working. And it's a very sad indictment of society that happens. But it is a real clue, that it's a real fact, that people are basically saying that the facts are no longer the facts. These are just different theories. These are competing theories. And they push that, and they push that, and they push that, and they advertise to that effect over and over and over and over. And it's, people are inundated with information, and they can't make heads or tails of all of it, and so they get enough of these commercials on their television in between watching episodes of Real Housewives or wherever, and that is what you come to believe, is that this is just one theory among many theories, and therefore I can then accept my own set of facts, the ones that fit me best. And that is a concerted effort. That is happening. And that, and people in positions like me who try to help to shape thought are constantly fighting against that. But you don't have the resources, really. I don't have commercials. If you don't come to this thing and read it, I can't untangle that.
How many people die in cars? Thousands of people. That's a clear fact. You can argue about it, but we still drive cars. So why don't we take the subway or the bus? I mean, it's
that gets into issues of psychology. We actually had an event about how people are attached. They are habituated to their car as a culture, right? People know that smoking is bad for you, yet they still smoke. So that's a larger question about how we're habituated to certain kinds of lifestyle, and whether facts can change that. We all do things that we know are not good, but we rationally, but we do them anyway. So.
And you just have to keep going. You have to keep trying to get the facts out there, even if they're single points. If they're complex, if they're artistically, beautifully done, you have to keep getting the facts out, because we know that machine is there. And you can say the opposite of that fact 5 times and people will start to believe it. So you just have to keep putting the fact out and saying it 6 times. With good visuals.
Right.
And pay attention to what Charles called the form fatigue, which is you have to say it and you have to find ways of saying it which cut through cut through the haze.
Yeah.
Right.
So
or embed it within a kind of larger story.
Yeah. And make it in people's self-interest.
You have to keep going, because those forces are there and they're very unfactual. So the best we can do is just to keep putting our facts out in very different forms and very different, there's an aesthetic quality to metrics that we need to keep pushing and driving forward and getting those messages out, because we know in those talk shows and those broadcasts, if you say it 5 times, it must be true.
Yeah. Well, this
It's
is
not
what
true.
serious journalism is for, and what we hope universities are for. So I want to thank our guests for demonstrating that tonight, and for coming, the two of you from coming out of town to be with us. And thanks. Thank all of you for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
What?